Let me just tell you that during the presentation, if you would please turn off your videos until the question and answer at the end of the program. And we will have your audio feeds muted as well until the end, and then we'll unmute. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of all our author presentations, and you'll have a chance to ask questions directly or place them in the chat. And the program will be recorded and available on the library's website. So perhaps you're wondering, what are indie authors and why do we celebrate Indie Author Day? An indie author is someone who self-publishes in order to reach as many readers as possible and grow a profitable author publishing business. So our annual Author Indie Day is a very special event for the library and its readers because it allows us to meet and celebrate achievements of our local and indie authors and writers. And today we have a wonderful panel of writers to share their experiences and poets. Let me introduce Sarah Kain Gutowski, Diana Haemer, Joseph Hickey, and Jerry Markowitz. We welcome you and thank you all for being here. And we are going to start with Sarah Kain Gutowski. Sarah Kain Gutowski is the author of Fabulous Beast Poems, Texas Review Press, and the winner of the 14th Annual National Indies Excellent Award for Poetry. Her poems have appeared in various print and online journals, including the Gettysburg Review, So to Speak, a feminist journal of language and art, Three Penny Review, Painted Bride Quarterly, and the Southern Review. So without further ado, let me introduce Sarah Kain Gutowski, and welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Liz.
Yes, we're delighted to have you. So we're going to ask the same questions of everyone, and our authors may have other pieces of information they'd like to share. But to start, if Sarah, could you tell us about yourself and what motivated you to write in your genre, or in this case, the genre of poetry? You might write in other genres as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Right now, I'm a professor of English at a community college on Long Island. So I teach writing and literature, just the first 2 years primarily. And I started writing when I was very little, and it was at the same time that I was reading. I was reading a lot too. And that continued until, up through high school. I got into journalism. But in college, I decided I didn't really want to pursue journalism anymore because I didn't like prodding into other people's business so much. I didn't like asking the difficult questions. I was a big coward when it came to that. So instead, I asked the big questions in poems now. I went to grad school at NYU, which was a really good experience, but also put me in a lot of debt. So now I'm teaching. I chose poetry because it's always been something kind of mysterious and a challenge to me. And so I read it and I thought, I want to do that. I want to participate in a conversation with other poets. The poets that I've read, I'm responding to their work.
Very interesting. Would you be able to share one of your favorite poems or pieces of work by you or another poet, and then let us know why?
Yeah, so one of the things and I'm going to share my screen in a minute. So I recently I'm working on a manuscript with a friend of mine, a colleague who is a visual artist, and she did the piece that's behind me right now. And she's making cyanotypes in response to my poems, and I'm making poems in response to her cyanotypes. And cyanotypes, they're a kind of photo paper process. You put an object on top of paper and place it outside in the sun and expose it for a couple of minutes, and then take it and rinse it underwater like you would a photograph, and an image appears. So I wrote a poem that was actually in response to a Sharon Olds poem. Sharon Olds is somebody, one of our greatest living poets, I suppose, right now. And she is widely anthologized. So this poem I've taught to my students before, and I guess it's always kind of been on my mind. And so I wrote in response to that. And then Meredith made the piece that's behind me in response to my poem. So I'll share my screen for the Sharon Olds poem. All right, so everyone can see the poem right now? Maybe not. Okay, thank you. All right. So, sex without love. How do they do it? The ones who make love without love. Beautiful as dancers, gliding over each other like ice skaters over the ice, fingers hooked inside each other's bodies, faces red as steak, wine wet as the children at birth whose mothers are going to give them away. How do they come to the God, come to the still waters and not love the one who came there with them, light rising slowly as steam off their joined skin? These are the true religious, the purists, the pros, the ones who will not accept a false Messiah, love the priest instead of the God. They do not mistake the lover for their own pleasure. They are like great runners. They know they are alone with the road surface, the cold, the wind, the fit of their shoes, their overall cardiovascular health, just factors like the partner in the bed and not the truth, which is the single body alone in the universe against its own best time. This poem, I guess I've taught it because I love the turns that it takes, the images, and it's really good for explaining to students the difference between metaphor and simile, and then also showing how like a poem progresses. And I love the surprise in it, how like it starts off with these very sensual images in the beginning and then moves into this very cold and non-sensual image of the runner in the wind. And it's kind of a downer too. Like it begins to talk about, it sounds optimistic in a way, like very affectionate, like how do people possibly make love without being in love with the other person? But at the end, she's the poet or the speaker is saying, because those people are smart, because they know in the end we're all alone, which is not the most uplifting message. So my poem that I'm going to read in response to that is, it came from kind of being at rest, as the poem starts out, and watching a couple who were older just swim at a pool together and thinking about where like they were doing something that they did every day together, and they were not alone, but they were also kind of singular. So this is a meditation on that. It's called The Couple. We at rest poolside witness this, how a couple becomes, is still becoming, at sunset, at 70. Palm fronds raise long shaking fingers to grasp at the gulf wind, but the man slips buttons through eyelets smoothly. The woman tucks her hair inside a cap. Assured, fluid, quick, they prepare to swim. He enters first and submerged beneath the pool surface. He does not see her step into the water, break its plane with her lean legs, and butterfly her way to the other end, where he has already turned for the next lap, leaving just enough space for her body beside him, a breadth of water meant for her, and she claims it, freestyle now, gaining then, meeting his strokes. But they are not synchronized. They are not a unit, but a pair, single bodies pushing against what surrounds, what resists, marking their own best time. Her head lifts to the left, an intake of air, while his face remains down, immersed. His arms cut the water ahead, while hers rise and carve by incremental fractions. Even if her toes push first from the wall into their next lap, they are together, side by side, and these movements are not rehearsed, are not the results of practice, but the practice itself. And thanks. That's just, yeah, so I mean, this is a demonstration kind of what I do as a poet is, I'm reading other poets and I'm reading their work and I'm thinking about the ideas that they bring to me, and then I put forth my own ideas. And I really think of it as like a larger conversation that we're having. And I'll stop to share.
So yes, I'm curious, when you're, well, first of all, that was a beautiful poem. And I'm curious how you, because when you interpreted Sharon Old's poem, you mentioned how sensual it was in the beginning and how sort of clinical or maybe cold it was at the end. And I'm curious, um, in your response so that I don't interpret for you, that how do you see what your poem is doing? And
My language. I suppose like it's not as obvious maybe in its sensuality because I think she's doing it very purposely in the beginning of her poem. When she talks about um, their fingers hooked inside one another. I mean, it's very graphic. Even when she's talking about the ice skaters, like she's speaking about, them gliding over each other like ice skaters. I mean, there's still a little bit of like that like cold imagery, but I mean, ice skaters, like they never, if you're pair skating, you're not allowed to like let go of your partner almost. Like those moments where you let go are very brief, So like in the beginning, these people are so close together physically. And so I kind of liked that like what I admired in the couple that I saw and that I was writing about, and then I was thinking about, of course, like my own life and my own partner, and like just the way we live side by side, and so that idea that like it is supposed to be a more hopeful poem, this idea that that in the end, we may be still physically separate, but there's this togetherness that still exists as we walk side by side through life. So it's not meant to be, I suppose, as visceral as Old's poem, but I mean, the act of swimming is so sensual in itself that I think it kind of mimics a little bit like or at least the words mimic some of like the language of lovemaking and two people together.
yeah, I love that image of immersion and immersive and in the pool space, and seeing one another, but
Yeah.
being together, sort of inextricably together because you're in the same space. So I thought that was really beautiful and well done.
That's a really nice reading of it. Thank you.
You're welcome. When you're working with your students, what do you feel gives them the best access to poetry? If people are trying to understand poetry, what do you feel has been the most successful way to have people enter sort of a poetic space? Because I think poetry has a reputation of being sort of notoriously hard to interpret. It's very, very personal. The language is very spare often, and well, sometimes it depends, but what have you found so that people who are joining us, if they want to, have better access to poetry or feel not intimidated perhaps by poetry, what do you do with your students since you're a teacher, professor?
Well, there's something like a little saying among teachers that if you love something, don't teach it because it'll destroy it by the end. But I actually don't believe that, because in practice, like especially with poetry, I find that if I talk about the poems that I really love, a lot of times like I know how to speak about it and I love it for a reason, and I've read it over and over again. So I'm more likely, and I model close reading with them. Like and I try to also tell them that like the first time you read a poem, you're not going to pick up on all the things that the poem is doing. Like that very rarely happens if it's a really good poem. But at the same time, a lot of times what the poem says is what the poem says. Like there's also this very literal meaning that is supposed to come across in the poem. Like it's, I mean, that's a rule that like might not apply to absolutely every poem or every like genre of poetry, I suppose, because there's subgenres of poetry. But for the most part, like sometimes what a poet says is what the poet means, and that everybody like comes to poems thinking they're going to be difficult, but a lot of times the poet is just being honest. And like giving you a clear picture, and you're looking, and sometimes you look for something that isn't there. So I try to make model the close reading and ask questions, I suppose, that I have also asked, and then try to get them to answer, those questions. And I mean, that's pretty much how I read poems. You go in, you say, okay, so what am I not understanding and why? And a lot of times if you work at that a little bit, you come to the answer, like you come to a better understanding of it. And sometimes a part of a poem is supposed to be mysterious just because it is. Like there are lines in T.S. Eliot, that like if you read the Wasteland, he's got footnotes for all of it because it's so dense and so difficult to understand. But there are parts where like that, some of my favorite parts of that poem have no footnotes because they're just like this image that embodies how he feels, but has nothing to do with, the fall of man and the decline of the century. And so I guess like if I was to say, for someone who was just approaching poetry, the Poetry Society of America has a listserv that you can sign up for now that they call it Walking with Poetry, I guess, or a walk with a poem or something. I'll have to find it and I'll put it in the notes for you. But it's this they'll get a poet, a published poet, to pick a poem by another poet, and they talk about why they love that particular poem. And so they do a kind of analysis of it. And that can really help, when you watch somebody else work their way through a poem, like it kind of helps you learn how to read it, which should be like slowly, openly, like with questions, and allowing yourself to be confused, but also like having some fun with that confusion. Like I think too often we come to poetry and we feel like we're stupid if we don't get it, but that's not supposed to be it. Like the poet isn't trying to make anybody feel stupid by like writing something that's cryptic. They're trying to write the thing the best way they know how, that feels truest to them.
That's a great way of thinking of it, I think. I feel like when you mentioned T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, because I've been trying over time to work my way through it, but there's some things that are very local. That's why they need footnotes, I think, and some things that are transcendent, and the things that you were talking about, the parts of the poem that don't have footnotes. It feels like that's where each of us can enter that space individually and make it what it means to us, which I think your poem did as well. There were parts of it I was trying to figure out, was he buttoning her up? Was he buttoning himself up with the eyelids? Like it went by a little fast, but I think that what you also said is just how you keep coming back to poetry, like any kind of writing, I guess, and you have to engage again and again and again. You might get a different meaning in a short period of time, and then years later you might say, oh my gosh, this means something different to me, perhaps because you're in a different place yourself.
Yeah, perspective has a lot to do with it too.
Yeah.
So
I guess tell us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about how you got your poetry into journals. You have these august, journals that you've submitted to. Was that something that you did over time through your graduate program? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I had one poem published in a prestigious journal, and it felt like such a fluke because I didn't have anything published after that for like 11 years. I mean, it was something I got a poem accepted into the Threepenny Review right before graduate school. I went to graduate school, and then there was just a dry spell of like a decade. So, I mean, if people are thinking it's really easy, it's really not. Even with graduate school, it didn't happen. And partly that's because I'm learning now, like I didn't submit enough, because you have to take chances. It is a matter of numbers and finding people who are receptive to your work. But then it's also, I just needed more craft. I needed time with my poems, for them to have something worth saying that people would want to read. So it was partly practice. And my book of poems I finished that in like 2011, and it was finally published in 2019. So that was a long time of like putting the poems together, submitting. I submitted I submitted that book to contests many times, because that's kind of the way for a lot of people to get published in poetry now. I mean, unless you find a smaller local publisher who knows your work because you go to like readings and things, and so they adapt you. But like I don't have that on Long Island, at least. Like there was no one local who was, publishers here. Like, I mean, I live on Long Island, so I'm close to like all the big 5 publishers. Like nobody's starting up a pressing competition with them because there's just, no need. But that path was, like kind of long and hard. And so I'm pretty grateful to have my book out.
Well, I'm sure it's just delightful. And I would say also that it does seem to be with any kind of writing, there could be a flavor of the month of the year. So in films, in novels, there's sort of it seems to me that there's waves of what people are looking for. And unfortunately, some of that is commercial, right? So what they think will, people might buy, that doesn't really necessarily take anything away from the fact that the writing is gorgeous and worth being read. But there are moments where, it's like, movies that are love stories and then movies that are action films, and then you can't get your film made, or
Right.
same thing,
Yeah, you do have to persist in a feeling that like, I think that your work is worth something, but you also have to realize too, at the same time, that like there are different times where your voice might be needed, and like times when it's maybe like, that's, I think, kind of how I got myself through like a 10-year gap, or how I also, was able to wait so long to get my book published, was that I was like, okay, it's just not my time. Like people, at this point, like there isn't an audience for my work. And then there was an audience for my work. Or like also it could just be that I found my audience finally, and it takes a lot of searching.
Wow, that's a beautiful thought. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your experiences, and your beautiful poem. I thought it was gorgeous. Okay, so our next poet is Diana Haemer. And Diana is an enthusiastic and introspective poet who has been writing since she was 16. A 2020 graduate of William and Mary, she hopes to combine her loves for marine science and English into a career as a science journalist and creative writer. Diana's work has been published in many literary magazines, the Sukarnochi Review, sorry about that, Short Edition, and William and Mary's The Gallery. And her poetry has been featured on Washington University in St. Louis Life /Lines blog, and in Local Gems Press's Tiku, Poems About Tea. Her first poetry collection, The Sands of Time, was published in December 2020, congratulations, by Local Gems Press. Sensing, her second book, was published in June by Atmosphere Press and was met with critical acclaim by 3 editorial reviews. And so without further ado, please welcome Diana Haemer. Welcome, Diana. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for having me.
Of course. So would you also tell us about yourself and what motivated you to write in this genre of poetry?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I took a creative writing class, and I took it online because I'm a competitive figure skater. So what was in the skating poem that Sarah just read, I thought that was very interesting. But I was taking the course online, and I didn't want to have time. I didn't want to have to take the time to go into class and write the final exam in person. So what my teacher let me do instead was to keep a poetry journal for the whole entire spring semester and then turn it into her at the end of the year. And I did that, and she wrote very encouraging comments and continued me to keep writing. But I would have kept doing so anyways, because I liked how short and concise poetry can be, and it can be a lot less overwhelming than writing a diary entry or, trying to write a short story and have a lot more words in that. Because I was skating a lot, I didn't have a lot of time to just write stories all the time. So poetry was very nice for me. In college, I kept writing and I took a lot of English classes and poetry courses. And I mostly liked the structure that poetry allows me. So when I have thoughts that are really long and convoluted, I can have, you know, a shorter way to portray that. And I like writing poems that have syllable limits or that have line limits, like sonnets and haikus and minute poems. But I also really enjoy being able to invent my own meter and my own rhyme scheme. So some poems might be free verse technically, but that's because I like to impose my own rules upon the poem, if I can say such a thing. I really enjoyed when I was in college being able to write just for fun. I didn't take very many courses in the English department related to craft. I more so enjoyed reading, like Sarah was saying, other people's poetry and other people's novels and feeling inspired by those instead. And I kept a manuscript. Actually, I kept two manuscripts. One was just of my haikus and the short Japanese poetry that I would read about in my spare time. And then others were more personal poems or longer poems or poems about nature. And during COVID, when it hit in March 2020, that was the semester I was supposed to graduate. So instead of having all my spare time being spent on fun graduation activities, I decided instead to edit my manuscripts and to submit them to different publishers for publication. And then luckily they were both accepted in 2020. So I published The Sands of Time, which was my little author copy, but this is my haiku collection, and it has other 3 and 5 line poems of Japanese style poetry. And then I have Sensing, which is my longer book by Atmosphere Press. They're also an independent publisher. They are based out of Texas, and they publish poets from actually all over the world. So it was felt very lucky to have gotten chosen by them to be published. And I spent most of my quarantine time writing and editing because I kept reading articles about how Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the pandemic, and I didn't want to shy away from any challenges and felt inspired by reading those articles. And I finally got my work out into the world.
Wow, that's extraordinary. What a great story. I didn't know that about King Lear and the pandemic. That's so interesting. I'm gonna have to look up more about that.
He wrote a lot. I think Shakespeare wrote a couple of his most famous works during the plague outbreak, one of the many plague outbreaks in London when all the theaters were closed. So he was, not necessarily stuck at home, but he couldn't be constantly putting on work. So he decided to write new pieces and edit old ones. But King Lear was, I think, the most famous one or most well-known one that came out of his time during quarantine and the plague.
Wow, that's so interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm also curious, what is one of your favorite poems or pieces of work by yourself or another poet? And can you tell us why?
Yeah, so I am going to read a couple of my poems, but I suppose first I can read a poem by another author. And a lot of my poems have to do with nature, and even the more personal ones. I love writing about the environment and the ocean, and different sorts of phenomena. So I double majored in oceanography and English in my undergrad, so I have a lot of scientific knowledge in the back of my brain that kind of came to light whenever I would write new poems. But I love reading famous poems about famous poets and seeing what they said, not necessarily about what was going on like socially or politically, but how that was reflected in how they saw nature. So when I was in college, I took a modern poetry class, and we read a lot of Yeats, as I'm sure you can imagine. And he wrote a poem called The Lake Isle at Innisfree. And I don't have it pulled up, but I can say it to you. I'll pull it up just in case. I won't share my screen with it though, but I'm sure for those of you who know Yeats, this isn't one of his more famous poems, like Easter 1916 is the one that everybody knows and quotes and reads all the time. But I liked this one because it's very beautiful, and it it's a very daydream sounding like poem. So especially during this past year when we're all stuck at home, it's nice to be able to remember something and read something that reminds us of a prettier and happier place. So, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows I will have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway, or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. So that was Yeats, obviously very beautiful. And I will now share my screen, not that I compare myself in any way to his poems, but let me see if I can get this. Oh, can I share? Oh yeah, okay, there we go. Okay. There. So, like I said, a lot of my poems have to deal with nature or deal with the themes of marine science, even if they are more personal in their subject matter. So I wrote this poem when I was in my physical oceanography class, and we were learning about eddies, specifically those that form in the Gulf Stream, when that's the warm current of water that comes from the equator all the way up the east coast of the United States. And as it does this, it kind of swirls off, and some of that hot water gets bubbled around in the cold, and some of the cold water gets absorbed into the hot jet stream until slowly the jet stream dissipates, because the different temperatures of the water eventually equal out. And I had an ex-boyfriend named Eddie, and he also was similarly hot and cold. So I wrote this poem thinking not so much of him, but mostly of my knowledge from my class, I'll say. So, and Eddie. Actually, I think I'm going to read it from my book. Hot and cold moving so quickly past each other that we intertwine at borders, causing friction at our touching edges start something new. Waveforms beget others until the border has wobbled enough, just so that parts of the inner heat and coolness may progress further towards the mass's core, rippling, believe it or not. This dichotomy strengthens the wobbling, as the cold one starts not to flow but to curve inward into enemy territory. Those still in the flow look precariously, as a small loop appears out of this transgression. Deeper in, deeper out, finally the hot decides it has had enough. The border reappears, just like nothing had happened, nothing at all. But look closer. What happened to the primordial circle? Zoom in and notice a swirling current, furious that now it must spin with abandon in the heat of the other. It remains unique despite the diffusion of its environment. Thermal equilibrium be damned. Out of spite it persists, thwarting the grand plan of forgetfulness and neglect, reminding the hot that once its border allowed a visitor through, only to cut off all contact, but a piece of the soul remains.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So that was one of them. I'll read another one of my poems from Sensing, and then I think a couple of my shorter ones are what I had prepared on this screen. Oops, does it? Okay. Oh yes. So this one is it's actually I'll tell you at the end. But basically, I wrote this poem when I was taking an environmental science class. It was environmental sociology when I was studying abroad at Oxford, and the professor was French, and she was very mistrusting of scientists because she had a philosophy and sociology background. So this poem was written after we had a slight argument about whether or not science is truly objective, or whether or not the people that do science are influenced by their own, wishes for how the experiment comes out. So, is objectivity an illusion? No respectable scientist or honest public servant can nimbly erase their opinions from a situation, and yet everyone files their emotions away nicely in a crisis, achieving precisely some level of empirical power. So this was actually an acrostic poem. So if you read down the lines, it spells out a word, which I think represents what I thought of her argument, if I may say so. The scientist in me really, really reared its head in that moment, because I thought that she wasn't making much sense. So
Very good.
thank you. And then I will read this one and then a few of my haikus. And then if you had any other questions for me, then I'll hand it back to you, Liz. So this poem I wrote, again, it is inspired by my learning about light in my physics class, and about rainbows, and about how prisms diffract the light and splinter just one beam into many little colors. And I wrote this when I was feeling particularly down and out after a breakup, and I was wondering, kind of, feeling a little bit hopeless, but then I kind of switched my mindset around and wrote this poem that I think kind of represents like how I felt like I needed to start out new, and I couldn't just, keep wallowing and only see myself as one beam of light, but I needed to see myself as the many colors that I could offer to others and to the world. So I wrote this poem, The Rainbow. The right person for me will be an addition, not a distraction, a faction in the party that is the life I live. Inaction breeds subtractions, and there are those who appear with their own agendas to peer at me, see how I could be a canvas for their infractions against humanity. I had pleased them, wholly at their mercy, the tabula rasa for their diffractions. But I am the rainbow now, the prism they never perceived I could be. So that was that. And then, thank you. And then we have just 3 different haikai, which is a general term for short Japanese poetry. And these are all from The Sands of Time. The Sands of Time was written because my family has a summer house on Cape Cod, so I go up there and I work there during the summers, either doing more science internships or working in the local environment. So the book is a collection of haiku based on my experiences on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and my observations there during over the course of a couple summers. So, rain. Rain ceaselessly drips slowly onto locust leaves, making them glow green. A seal. Off the bough there is a round protrusion. It turns a nosy face to me. Defiant fish. To the top of the stream swims salmon, succeeding with great vigor to make a fool of nature's ways and a mockery of their peers. So I can stop sharing my screen now because I believe that was all that I had for poems prepared. So, yeah.
So I'm first of all, those were beautiful, really evocative, and very personal. I'm touched. I'm touched, and I'm curious about the vulnerability that poets share, even when you're writing about something that seemingly has seemingly diverged from something personal. So in your case, you wrote about eddies, and there may be an eddy, but these eddies. So I'm curious about 2 things. How do you feel about being vulnerable, or do you feel vulnerable in your poetry? And is nature a way to sort of refract that a bit, to sort of give yourself some space? And then how do you plan to use oceanography and poetry and or English in your future?
Yeah, so I definitely do feel like writing poetry puts me in a very vulnerable position. Most of my poems I actually like physically write out. I don't keep them on the computer because I like the more diary-esque and journal aspect of actually being able to write poems. And many times I do write very personal poems, but I feel as though they aren't, as quality enough because they're written a lot in first person, and they might, some of them have more metaphors than others, but I always feel as though it's a special achievement to be able to see somehow my life and my my personal life and my thoughts and my feelings mirrored in my environment around me, and whenever I'm able to capture that, I feel as though that's really meaningful to me. And I definitely, I mean, I am still writing poetry and also typing up a lot of old poems. I have like tons of notebooks that I've filled up, and also in my school notes and in my like notebooks and everything that I had in classes. Sometimes I would like write in the margins or flip onto the back of the paper. So I still have to find all of those and type all of those up. But as of right now, I'm not completely like certain of the path. I am applying to different grad schools, both here and in the UK and in Ireland as well, to get a master's degree in English. And I believe that being able to learn more about great writers and great authors will make my poems better. And then if I'm able to become a better poet, I'll be able to better incorporate my knowledge and my background of science into everything that I write, even if sometimes it's just a couple words or a little bit more of a scientific jargon, or if I make a metaphor regarding like the glaciers melting in because of climate change as sort of a metaphor for something that's happening in my life, I feel as though that's another way to incorporate some important science into the more literary aspect and more literary side of things.
That's a very interesting perspective. And I have to say, although I'm sure everyone is hesitant to compare themselves to great authors, I see a personal side to the Yeats poem that you read in the same way. So sort of taking nature and allowing personal vulnerabilities and feelings to come through. Just from my point of view, I think that you've done a really remarkable job doing that.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot.
How did you come to Haikai? Is that correct? How did you discover that?
I would write it a lot in elementary school because I went to a Montessori school, so they always tried to incorporate lots of different aspects of learning in order to encourage us to read and to write. And because haikus are only 3 lines, it's very easy to kind of get little kids to do that. But I always used to write them, and then Local Gems Press was offering I was on their email list, and they were offering a free course of sorts. It was an online course into how to write haikai, like different kinds of Japanese poetry and why they're called different things, because haikus are specifically about nature, whereas zappais are about everything else, and then they have different names like rangas for the 5-line poems. And it was a lot of learning about how the syllable limit isn't the most important aspect of writing haikus, especially because a lot of great Japanese haikus that are translated into English don't have the same limits because of the translation and everything. So it's a lot about learning to focus on a specific subject matter instead of focusing on a specific pattern and structure and everything. So I always like to write them because they're shorter. So if I don't have much time, then I would do that. But yeah, I think that they're really unique and they're really interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your poetry and your insights. It was delightful. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Of course. And now we'd like to welcome Joseph Hickey. Joseph Leo Hickey III is a prolific poet and the author of 14 poetry books, including I Know Nothing But Miracles, Walt Whitman Speaks to the Modern World, American Born, Psalms of the Silent Nation, and The Last Poem. He is the founder of Melodium House. His poetry showcases a marriage between the narrative and lyricism. So please welcome Joseph Hickey. Welcome, Joseph, to the poetry panel.
Oh, there we go. Okay, there, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Okay, so well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're delighted. So I'll start the same way I started with Sarah and Diana. Could you tell us about yourself? And then what motivated you to write in the genre of poetry?
Absolutely, I'll answer both those questions. So
Okay.
first of all, basic background about myself is that, let me just start from the beginning. I started writing poetry when I was like in middle school, so I was very young, started writing. Originally my poetry, I was under the impression that all poetry had to rhyme, and it was like, and it was all a bunch of rhyming poetry. And actually, some of those earliest poems do make it into my first book, but not very many of them. But my first book is Baptism of Apathy, which was published in 2015. But as I began to progress with my writing style, initially my writing usually focused entirely on myself and the things I was feeling. But eventually, as time went on, the writing style evolved to the point where it was focusing mostly on characters who might in some circumstances be feeling some things that I'm personally feeling, but and they do draw inspiration from my life. But there's something about having a character speaking the poem that it's not, it can be more personable to the other person in some sense if it's a character rather than yourself and just speaking about yourself. And you can do more things with a character than you can with just talking about yourself. Like, and you can open up more avenues of conversation in that way. So basically, I just want to go over a brief overview of all my books. The first one was Baptism of Apathy, that came out initially in 2015. All these books are self-published, by the way, or published through Melodium House, which is my company that I founded. Baptism of Apathy is a book mostly about my early life personal experiences, going from when I started writing poetry in middle school all the way up to I'd say actually the beginning of grad school, really. So that there's a long stretch of like 11 years in that time frame. But with that book is the first book I really started hammering down on just mixing personal experience with the characters I was writing about. In the case of the book, there were two main characters. One is named Christian, the other is named Natalie. The character Christian, his name comes from the Pilgrims Progress character. Is basically like he's on a religious journey through the book. The book is basically, the first book is basically a veiled treatise against religious extremism, and we're talking like the most extreme form of religious extremism that really wants to like burn heretics at the stake with no exaggeration. So it's basically a criticism of that kind of mindset in the whole book. In the book, it tells the story as if that point of view was true, but the world is about to end, and then that version of God is about to come and judge the world, and almost everyone ends up going to hell. So it's basically a criticism of that mindset. After that, my next book was Unity, which pretty much it still has spiritual themes, but it strips the explicit religious undertones from the previous book. It no longer has that. Basically, it's a shorter book than Baptism of Apathy, but it's basically the theme of it is that when you have different characters' voices coming together based on their parallel experiences, it shows how united people can be based on parallel experiences that they have, and they're not too different from each other. Sort of like, this is around the time when I started really getting into Walt Whitman, so that was a huge influence. All my poetry, the vast majority of my poetry from this period was free verse, and Walt Whitman, his poetry is also free verse, but he does have that same kind of theme about like how people are united in such a sense that even if they're opposed to each other, there is sort of a union there. To Walt Whitman, the good and the bad are all equally as needed in the world as the bad things are as needed in the world as the things that are really evil and horrible. For example, he has this poem that states that I'm the poet of the body, I'm the poet of the soul, I'm the poet of the slave and of the masters of slaves. And that's really not like a perspective you would think someone would take, but it really shows that the unity there to be had between people of totally different backgrounds, even if one person is doing heinous crimes and the other person is being the victim of those crimes. Okay, then the next book is Love Poems at the End of Our Lives, which is a story. Well, it's not exactly a story. It's a book where it tells from the perspective of different characters. Again, these characters are known by the poetic names, which means it's not their actual names, but a name based on the emotion they embody. The female character in the book is named Serenity. The male character is named Pain. And basically the main gist of that book is it's about the character Pain's grief as the character Serenity was murdered, and he's trying to move on from the death of that character. It's told through poems that reflect both my personal life as well as the point of view of the characters. The next one is where things really get interesting, which is Leafy, which is actually an Afrikaans word, which is a language in South Africa. Leafy means lover, and Leafy is also the name of the title character, who is a African American character who is, I wrote this just before like the Black Lives Matter movement really started to take off. And he is a character who is murdered because of his race in America. And it really shows the tragic things that happen as a result of racism. And also the person who he's married to is named Harmonie, which is an Afrikaans word that means exactly what it sounds like. And she is a political activist from South Africa who's basically battling all the problems that country is facing, like the poverty and things like that. And she is a white Afrikaans South African who was also murdered because of the political opposition she was facing, as well as an aspect of that would also be her race. So it really shows that like when you hurt someone else who has a different skin color or something like that, or some kind of reason that doesn't matter, humanity is so connected in such a way that you're really going to be hurting yourself, because you like there's humankind, even though we have a lot of differences between different groups of people, everyone is so interconnected in some way that there's no way to really escape from that reality. So that really makes racism in itself absurd. And then we have just briefly the rest of my books. I'll go through faster than the earlier books. The next one is The Last Poem, which is a sequel to Love Poems at the End of Our Lives, which is about this character named Pain again. It's basically one long poem about him mourning the loss of serenity. The next poem is Purity. The next book is Purity Redeemed, which is about basically that's just a bunch of poems about my personal life and things I've been feeling. It's more personal poems than it's taking a break from the character-driven things usually, for the most part, and it was focusing mostly on things I was feeling, mostly shorter poems, things like that. The next book is The Penultimate Poems, which is poems from the perspective of this high school student again named Serenity, from before she died, like all the poems she wrote before her death. The next poem is Harmonie, which is the direct sequel to Leafy. Then we have The Revenant, which is a poetic story about, basically it's a poetic story I co-wrote with this author named Amelia Vandergast from the UK. And it's about the character Serenity. In a poetic way, she comes back to life after her death. And it's about her experience, about her being resurrected 25 years after she was murdered. And the only reason I could do that is because it's poetry. Like, you don't have to follow any rules really with poetry regarding like a story. Like, if you're telling a story, it has to be really consistent. You can't really jump from one scene to the next, and you can't have no explanation about how the characters got in a certain situation. But with poetry, what I love about it is you can jump from one thing to the next really quickly and without any explanation, just to tell like have for the reason of being poetic about it. And then the next book is I Know Nothing But Miracles, Walt Whitman Speaks to the Modern World, which is basically, with that book, I took the character of Walt Whitman and put him into the 21st century instead of the 18th century. The whole book is one poem from his perspective, basically like a new version of Leaves of Grass. Then we have True Daughter of the Soil, which is a sequel to Harmony and Leafy. Takes place 50 years after the original books take place. And that follows the story of a extremist political party taking over South Africa. And basically in the past, we have Harmony and Leafy's words. All the poems are from Harmony and Leafy's perspective. And we have this new character named Sanger, who tells us the perspective of how everyone ignored the message this political activist had, and now everything is going crazy in that country. And then 3 more books left. There's a Serenity in the Dark, which is a continuation of The Revenant, that resurrection storyline. And then we have American Born, Psalms of the Silent Nation, which is a partner book to True Daughter of the Soil, which follows the character of the same characters, but basically the inspiration for that book is there was a week in July where my fiance, who is actually South African, she was very, very scared of the things that were happening in her country, because there were some severe, very, very severe rioting where the grocery stores were all looted. Things were burned down. It was really horrible. She didn't know she was going to survive it, or if it would end. Eventually, thank God it did end, that the rioting and everything ended. But at the end of that, I was like, during that time, I started writing and just writing about my anger and the experience. So basically that book is about a political, again, an extremist political party taking over South Africa, taking the conclusions based on the writing that was happening and taking it to an extreme level. And then the last book I have out so far is The Last and Eternal Fire, which is, in a way, it's a parallel book to the last poem. In the last poem, the character Pain is lamenting the death of Serenity. In The Last and Eternal Fire, it flips the roles around and has Serenity lamenting the death of Pain. So those would be a good summation of my poems. My books so far. And I realize I have 7 minutes left, so sorry for that long-winded discussion about the books, but that'll be the summary of what I've been doing so far. The most recent book was published this year. I've been trying to publish 3 books a year ever since 2017.
Well, thank you. Wow, Joseph, that's a lot to publish 3 books in a year. It's a lot to publish 1 book in a year. So I think if you were going to give your character name, it would be prolific.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I said in the description. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting when you mentioned Pilgrims Progress and how the characters have qualities as their names. It reminds me of morality plays, medieval morality plays. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Do you have a background in the theater by any chance?
No, but I think I actually got the concept of the character having poetic names from actually a music album that actually told a story. It's like a rock opera. It's American Idiot by Green Day. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that. It was a very famous record, but it basically in that book, not that book, that album, I should say. You have the Billy Joe Armstrong wrote like an epic rock opera, which tells the story of this character named Jesus of Suburbia, I would consider that a poetic name as well. It's not a real name, it's a poetic name. And he is a character that is basically going through the events after the post 9/11 in America, basically how everyone was going crazy about how are we going to be bombed? We got to duct tape our windows, and everyone was really fearful of retaliation happening from Iraq. And basically that tells a story about that character who's living during that time and his experiences. Also there's other characters in the story named Saint Jimmy, what's her name, etc. So it's like all the characters have poetic names. So that's pretty much where I got that from. I think so. That's where I got it from. Yeah. That's
very interesting. It's so interesting because writers we're all inspired. If you write or if you're doing art, it's inevitable that you'll be influenced or be inspired by others who are doing your craft. So that's very interesting. Do you have a favorite piece of work or writing by yourself or another poet? And if so, what would that be?
Well, a big poem I got inspiration from was this poem by Raul Alvarez. It's published by this publishing company that no longer exists anymore because, frankly, the person who started it got canceled for reasons I don't want to discuss. But basically, this guy is independent of the guy who started the company. So, but this book is no longer in print anymore. The book is called "There Was So Much Beautiful Left." The part of the poem, I can't read the whole poem because I believe it's still under copyright, but I can read an excerpt from it because I know this is being recorded. So let's see. I just have to pull it up for 1 second. Thought I had it. It's just gonna be a short excerpt from it. So this poem, what I got from this poem, mostly, this has been a great inspiration for me, this poem. And the biggest thing about it is how the character, the writer jumps from one thing to the next in the poems to basically, I've adopted that in a lot of poems I've written. And Walt Whitman uses that technique a lot as well. There's this section I want to read from it. So here it goes. Let me tell you a story. This one time a man asked me for change at the LaSalle Blue Line station, and I had $40 in my pocket. So I told the man no, and he paused and then asked, do you have any change? And I said no, and he paused and asked, do you have any change? And I said, I do, but I don't want to give it to him. And he said, why? I lied to him twice. And I said it was easier than telling him I didn't love him. And he said, why did I lie to him again? And he said, what do you mean? He said, Raul, I know you love me. And he gave me a kiss on the cheek, and we stood there while 10,000 trains came and went. And I called him father, and he called me a beautiful pile of feelings. And when I think about him, my fingers turn pink. Every night when we all have the same dream but can't remember it. But I cut a hole in the ground beneath my apartment and dug my way down to where all the bones are and saw that they spelled out the dream is that we are all the same person. And that's a poem by another poet. I can also read one by myself.
Okay.
All right, so that was again, that was from There Was So Much Beautiful Left by Raul Alvarez. Now this is from Harmonie, the book that's been mostly critical acclaimed by that I've written so far. Again, this is the character, follows the character of Leafy and Harmonie, Leafy is an American, Harmonie is a South African political activist. This poem is entirely from the perspective of the character Leafy. Walking through these empty streets, singing, humming about her ocean eyes, life grips us and takes us away, and we fall through the many-colored sky, where you know that the person who will come to save you will never be me, where you know that the person who kisses our children goodnight will never be me, where you know that the dreams we share cast their shadow on an even darker world. And this world lightens up from the shadows that we cast, because in comparison, we are brighter than the sun shining. And we know our truth is offensive to the world. And we know I had a dream. We were sitting on the edge of the waterfront. We were drinking and making fun of all the people who thought they could bring us down 1,000 times over again. The world will rise and greet the flames and be consumed and be altered and then be totally transformed. And then the world will be inebriated by the breath of its own evaporation. And then the world will stand and then run desperately away and fall into the arms of those who loved it, but no longer loved it, because the world had an identity crisis and didn't realize why it was here and didn't realize what it needed to do, a way out of its own callous shell. And I have scars that have not healed, but the light hides them. I fell in love with her deep blue eyes. They stood alone in mystery, and her heart was pure and lovely. But because the world didn't understand it, it left her all alone. And as she waited for the world to reject her, Harmonie wrote a powerful love letter to the world, saying no matter how drunk it became, or no matter how many times it wanted to see other people, that she would always be a loyal lover. But the world was violent to her, and she ran into my arms, where we promised each other the same things, but kept the promise and never broke it, until the world came back to destroy her. And this sadness grew, and the world moved on from the anger it had against Harmonie, because the harmony was gone from the world for several hundred years, and the world descended into a fit of racism, inequality, and crippling poverty, and we stood afar off and wept for the world, for what was about to happen to it.
That was beautiful. That was, it's seems like it's almost like a poetry song of some kind.
Yeah, yeah, I do take a lot of inspiration from music, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and your inspirations, and for sharing your work. And it was delightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we have our last poet that is joining us today, Jerry Markowitz. Jerry Markowitz has worked over 30 years in education and training. He teaches at Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University nearby, and participates in the Thomas Jefferson Library Writers Group, and is writing a second book of poems. So please welcome Jerry Markowitz. Jerry, thank you so much for joining our poetry panel. So he's going to unmute himself. Can you unmute yourself? No? Let's see.
Okay, got it.
Oh, good.
Okay. Thank you, Liz.
Yes, of course.
I was a little concerned I might have to rely on people lip reading
No.
my comments, but it worked out. Thank you,
Yeah,
Liz, for
thank
inviting me. And yes, I do teach at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason. And I've been writing poetry occasionally over about 20 years, but recently I've been writing much more poetry, spending much more time on poetry. And my first book, Poems That Rhyme Most of the Time, is lighthearted and humorous. And the second book I'm writing is a little more thought-provoking. But why poetry? What motivated me to write poems? Well, first, writing poems is challenging. It's challenging to write a short story or describe a person or event in vivid terms, limiting the number of words, appreciating every essential word. And I draw my ideas from the seemingly unlimited nouns, verbs, and adjectives from our language. And living and writing are intertwined, or said another way, poetry and living are intertwined. So poetry is a good way for me to describe or express a wide range of ideas, opinions, observations. And when completing a poem, it's okay. I realize that my poems don't rhyme all the time. And that's basically a summary of my background and what motivated me to get more involved in poetry than perhaps short story writing, because poetry, I think for me, gives me a wider range of opportunities than simply a short story.
Very interesting. Thank you. I thought it was interesting you said you can pick essential words from the limitless words available to us. And it seems to me that on any given day with any poem, there is that limitlessness, and you have to pare it down to just the right perfect words that will say what you need to say. I'm curious if you will tell me, do you have a favorite piece of work of your own or another poet? And if so, why?
Well, actually, I have 3 short poems I'd like to read, and then I have 2 poems by one of my favorites, Shel Silverstein.
Okay.
And I like my poems and his poems because they're both short, lighthearted, humorous, and many times there are surprises in there. And that surprise, sometimes it's uplifting, sometimes it's motivating. I've read my poems in the writers group. I read my poems to some of the residents at the Gardens. It's an assisted living facility nearby. And so let me read first two of the poems by Shel Silverstein. And if you're not familiar with him, he was popular in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. He was a songwriter, a cartoonist, and many of his books are still available, particularly in the Fairfax County Library. And so one of his poems called The Acrobats. I'll swing by my ankles, she'll cling to your knees as you hang by your nose from a high up trapeze. But just one thing, please. As we float through the breeze, don't sneeze. And his second one is hug of war. I will not play at tug of war. I'd rather play at hug of war, where everyone hugs instead of tugs, where everyone giggles and rolls on the rug, where everyone kisses and everyone grins, and everyone cuddles and everyone wins.
That's so sweet.
And I'll read 3 of my short poems, and I try to keep my poetry to one-word titles, because again, it helps me to focus and get into some depth, whether it's humorous or thought-provoking. So the first one I call Mice. There's a mouse in the house, so we got 2 more mice, and that's nice. One's wired, 2 are not, and that means a lot, because now more users can use 3 computers. And in the second one here, I call it Flew. Willie and Millie flew from the sky, landing nearby on a tree. On that tree is a bee, so Willie and Millie quickly flee. And the bee is buzzing with glee, because it found its own special tree. And the other one I'd like to read, I call Mail. Said to the one who's wagging its tail, let's check if there's any mail. So we walk together in this great weather to see whether there's any mail before we walk on the nearby trail.
That's lovely.
Oh, thank you.
Is the last poem about yourself and your beloved dog? Is it about
Not,
you? No?
not exactly, although we did have a little English pug growing up. No, actually, it's not necessarily. But of course, the motivation was recalling this dog that actually lived 17 years.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the poem on mice is our use of mice or
Right.
a mouse as we use computers.
Yes.
And the flu one is simply I saw some birds flying around. So again, bird is a noun. That's one of many. Like I say, many of my ideas come from. There's so many nouns around. I can pick a noun like train, and I wrote a poem about a train, and so on.
It's interesting. I think all of you that are with us today, poets, it's interesting to hear where you get your inspiration and how you make your poems form and live, and what space you give them. It's really very fascinating. It's interesting. This reminded me of Robert Frost a bit. Your 3 poems. So I'm curious, because you teach people who are doing lifelong learning. What do you find that how they experience either your poetry or poetry that you're presenting to them? Do you think they come at it from a different perspective than you would have anticipated, or just curious?
Yeah, sort of yes and no. I think people that are let's say older than 40 or 50, we'll keep it at that, like poems that are short and present a message or are thought-provoking And since I actually do have a little time, I can read 2 more short poems that are maybe not quite as lively, but a little slightly more serious than the 3 others. And I think older people, like you say, over 40 or 50, appreciate the shortness of and the focus of poems, or the crystallized thought of poems. I mean, today people are living to 90 and 100 years old, and I think some of my poems are actually motivating to people that are older adults. So if I could read the next one, called Respect, and maybe that gets also into how people appreciate lifelong learning, and the idea of poetry. The next one is called Respect. Who deserves respect? The teacher who wrote a book, or the chatty fast food cook? The maintenance man who cleaned the can, the doc who saved a life, or the neighbor's midwife? Maybe the family shopping together in bad weather, or anyone who tries their best, deserves respect, not neglect.
It's beautiful.
And thank you. And the last one I had prepared, I call it simply, I call it Winter. Got the notion to put some lotion on these dry, chapped hands, caused by the bold, cold weather that comes every year for all to bear. Yet in a blink, spring is here, winter was there.
That is where we're going into, so it's apropos. Absolutely. I love the spareness. I love the shape. I feel like I could put them in a diamond or a triangle or circle, and I feel that you could almost hand them as a present to someone. It's really it's very lovely. So if we can, shall we open the floor and let our guests ask you poets? I'm going to allow everybody to unmute themselves. Thank you so much. And you can turn your video on if we want us to see your lovely faces, or you don't have to if you don't want to, but please feel free to unmute yourselves. And if you would like to ask a question of our panel, you can just please do that. I see a baby. Maybe that baby wants to ask us a question. So as we're waiting, if anybody would like to ask, please chime in. But I'm just curious, if you had to say one poet who was maybe your inspiration, maybe not the first, but maybe, who would that be for the panel? I have a feeling I might know, but I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, or at least some. Do you have one that just was the sort of impetus for you to, as far as poetry goes, or was it a collective?
For me, my mom always liked to read Emily Dickinson poems to me, and I really liked hers, especially how she's so self-assured, and even though as a person, she was very shut away from the world and might not have had, enough success in her lifetime as in getting poems published, but I like reading the confidence that she has in her poems, even though some of her poems are can be very dark and about death, but she doesn't have any fear in her poems, which I really enjoyed. Really inspired me when I was younger.
That's very interesting. I think your perspective is so interesting. It can be something dark, but a certain confidence in what you're writing can be so inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry, Joseph, Sarah, do you have, oh, Leslie has raised her hand. Please feel free to ask a question, Leslie. I think you have to unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat. So while she's working on unmuting herself, Joseph, Sarah, Jerry, do you have if you had to say one poet that maybe sent you into the poetry genre, is there one?
Well, for me, it was definitely Walt Whitman, just because of his, I know I mentioned this in my presentation, but he has very grandiose and like all-encompassing writing style, like a cosmic kind of writing style that really represented the nation of America at the time of his writing.
Mhm.
And like what he did inspired me to a very severe degree, I would say.
And I thought your poem had its cosmos of its own, so I feel like that you've echoed Whitman's creation of a sort of larger cosmos, and a very uniquely American one for sure. Interesting.
Mhm.
Sarah, do you have a poet that
To Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. I think the two of them, I find a lot of women of my generation, like when I speak to them, like other women who like poetry, that was kind of their entry into poetry. They have a lot of very vivid images, like a really unique way of using metaphor, and they're powerful female voices. But I think as time has gone on, like I've had more of an appreciation of Plath, simply because her work is like a formalist. I like the way she uses form and meter. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, I think there is, that aspect of poetry that can be intimidating. The meter, the literary figures that, the figures of speech that are used in poetry can be very, dense but I think even if that isn't available to everybody to understand, it's the right part of the writer's tools, the poems are still accessible because they say something, they mean something. That's very interesting. Jerry, and you said Shel Silverstein, yes?
Yes, Shel Silverstein. Also, Emily Dickinson. I've read some of her poems. I've read some of Ogden Nash's poems, but they're a little uncanny, so to speak. They're not always quite what I have in mind. But I recently read a book by Stephanie Burke. She teaches at Harvard, called Don't Read Poetry. And it was very enlightening because she describes some of the ways poetry can be useful, helpful to people, sometimes how we read the poem. And every poem is different, and everybody reacts to individual poems very differently. So I found that book very interesting. And as far as, well, Robert Frost was interesting. His well-known poem, "The Road Least Taken." In fact, I'm reading a book now describing more of that poem that people have misunderstood. So I think there's a lot of poems and poets that is worth rereading to get additional insights.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Is it anybody, so it says I can't unmute, okay. But I do love the impact of Diana's words and the intercession of how she relates the natural world to the universality of feeling. It is, i.e., so relatable.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm glad that you enjoyed my poems and about what I said about nature and our own personal thoughts interacting. I'm glad that resonated with you.
Yes, and it was a treat to have everybody. I wasn't necessarily expecting everybody to be able to read their poems, and I think that made a big difference to hear you as poets read your work. There is actually an effort at the Folger Shakespeare Library to, if people are interested, to capture poets reading their own works. So perhaps I will have to get all of you in touch so that you reading your own works is very, very compelling, I have to say, to hear how you hear your work read out loud. And also for posterity, it really matters to have the poet speaking their own words. So thank you for that. Well, we're coming to the end of our program. If anybody would like to, if anybody has any one last question, I'm happy to post it. And the person said, I love that each of the poets had such a different approach to writing poetry. There's no one way, but a multiple of genres and a way of expressing one's thoughts. Hear, hear. I think that is really very astute and very meaningful. There's so many ways of self-expression and expression about the world. We have the local and the transcendent, and it seems to me that all of our poets today have touched on both, and it's remarkable to be able to do that. Leslie says, I'm happy the New York Review of Books is going to review sensing.
Oh yeah, that's so I told her about how the New York Review of Books reached out to me actually in like the past couple days before, so I wasn't able to like send everything to you, but they're going to be featuring sensing in their holiday issue, which is my newest book of poems, so I'm really excited.
Oh, I'm so happy for you. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations. It's
Thank
well
you.
deserved. All of our poets, you are all remarkable. Your ability to capture in words, to use language, to get the human experience, it's just remarkable. And we're so delighted you joined us. We hope at some future time you'll join us again. But thank you so much for your time. And we wish you all a very happy Friday, and tomorrow, happy Indie Author Week. Keep writing, everyone. And our poets, you were inspiring to me and to everyone. I know that. So thank you so much and take care.
Thank you,
Thank
Liz.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for everything.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.